Okay, if you remember where we left off last time, we just finished up our president class. So now let's go ahead and jump over into our main.cpp file and start writing some code. You can see here this is the default code that gets added by Xcode. We'll go ahead and delete that. We don't need that. So before we start actually writing the code to parse the files, let's go ahead and create some code so that we can verify that our parsing methods are actually working. And so basically what we want to do is create a little function where we can pass in two lists and it returns true or false if those lists are equal. So the first thing we want to do is actually create a list of our expected presidents. So in order to do that, we're going to need to bring in the vector class. Let's go up to the top and include vector. And we will also need to include our newly made president class. Okay. So if we jump down into our main function, we can create, actually before we do that, let's scope in vector. That way we don't have to type standard vector each time. Okay, so we create a new vector in our main class and make a new president. We'll call this expected list. And I'm actually going to go ahead and go over to my CSV file, copy all the data from there, jump back into our main, and paste it. So we're dealing with a vector. So we want to add each of those lines into our list. So we do expected list.pushback, and then George Washington string space, and we'll leave the 1 right there. Oh, that doesn't help. We want to actually create a president, George Washington 1. There we go. And so this is where our little handy constructor comes in. That way we don't have to create a new president and then set each one of those values. I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this line and do this for the other 4 presidents. Let's get all of our quotes in line. Close off the function. All right. So now we've created our expected list. Let's go ahead and create that function I was talking about that's going to compare those lists. So we'll type in what we're going to call it here. So verify. Actually, let's just do verify lists. We will pass in the expected list, and it's going to need to take another list. So for now, let's go ahead and return expected list. And so if you remember, I said that this was going to return a Boolean. So if it's true, we'll assume that the lists are the same. If it is false, we'll assume that the lists are different. So let's do an if check here. That way we can output to the user whether or not the list passed its comparison or not. So if it is true, it passed the list. So let's output a message. The lists are equal. Else the lists are not equal. Okay, so now let's go ahead and implement this function. So come up here and we'll create a bool verify lists. Now we don't want to modify the lists that are getting passed in, so we'll create a constant vector of president reference expected constant vector president actual. And by default, this will return true unless it's otherwise proven not to be true. So the first thing we want to check on the lists are the size. If the sizes of the two lists are not the same, then we know that they're not equal. So we just do a quick check. If expected size does not equal actual period size, return false. The next thing we want to do is we actually want to iterate over the two lists and compare each of their three values. So in order to do that, we just make a simple for loop. I is less than the expected period size plus I. Now we don't need to check that the index is also less than the actual size because we've already checked up here that the sizes are in fact equal. Okay, so now we're going to get the precedence out. So P1 equals expected period at 0, at I. P2 equals actual period at I. Okay, now we can do our checks. So if P1 period first name does not equal P2 period first name, return false. If P1 period last name does not equal P2 period last name, return false. If P1 period rank does not equal P2 period rank, return false. And so you'll notice that if we have two lists that contain the same data but they're in the wrong order, this check is going to fail. And that's okay. Sometimes that's okay. Sometimes you'd actually want to sort them first. But in this case, we're just going to do a straight up comparison walking down each of the lists. So if we go ahead and build this, we should succeed. And we can run it. Oh, sometimes this pops up when I'm not on my admin box for some reason. Okay, so we can see that debugging of files ended normally. And so I can look at the results by coming up to the build or the run menu, clicking console, and we can say, hey, the lists are equal. That's good. Didn't really check too much, but that's okay. Alright, so in this video we created our expected list and we created our verify list method. In our next set of videos we'll actually go ahead and create the function to read our first CSV file.